The gunshot cracked the morning air just as Elsie Hawthorne stepped onto the platform outside the Stone Valley freight office, and the stranger's hand closed around her wrist before she could process either sound. Settle in, and let this frontier collision sweep you into a story where trust is the riskiest currency of all. She yanked free the instant her back hit the clapboard wall, pulse hammering, and stared at the man who'd just pulled her out of the line of fire. He was taller than most, lean and sun-worn, with hair the color of old leather and eyes that tracked the shooter's retreat down the alley with professional calm. The man in the black hat vanished around the corner, and the stranger finally looked at her. His gaze was steady, weighing, and far too knowing for a man she'd never met. "You all right?" he said, and his voice carried the dust of long trails. Elsie forced her breathing to slow. She'd been 3 seconds from boarding the morning freight wagon to collect the lumber shipment that would keep Whisper Ranch's barn standing through winter. Now her gloves were scuffed, and her pride was rattled, and this stranger was still standing too close. "I'm fine," she said, and heard the snap in her own voice. "Who are you?" He stepped back half a pace, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his weathered face. "Gideon Sloan," he said. "Cattle buyer. Just got in on yesterday's stage." "And you'd be Elsie Hawthorne." Her stomach dropped. The name recognition wasn't a comfort. She'd been expecting a cattle buyer for weeks, someone the railroad investors had recommended to evaluate her herd before they finalized their offer on the land. But she hadn't expected him early, and she certainly hadn't expected him to throw himself between her and a stray bullet. Or maybe not so stray. The thought curled cold in her chest. "That was meant for you," she said, watching his face. He shrugged, easy as breathing. "Could be," he said. "I've made enemies. Comes with the work. But I'd guess it was meant to scare you more than kill either of us." She wanted to argue, but the sick truth was, he might be right. The railroad buyout had split Stone Valley down the middle. Half the town thought selling to the railroad would bring prosperity. The other half thought it would destroy the independence that made the valley worth living in. Elsie owned the largest working ranch left in the region, and her decision would tip the balance. She'd been holding out for weeks, and the pressure was starting to crack her resolve in ways no one could see. Especially not this stranger, with the careful eyes and the trail dust still on his coat. "I didn't ask for your help," she said, and pushed past him toward the freight wagon. The driver was already climbing down, his face pale. "Miss Hawthorne, you sure you're all right?" he called. She nodded once, sharp, and reached for the crate of nails she'd ordered. Gideon's hand got there first. He lifted it like it weighed nothing, and set it in the wagon bed without asking permission. Then, he met her glare with that same unreadable calm. "I'll be out to Whisper Ranch this afternoon," he said, "to look at the cattle." She wanted to tell him not to bother, but the truth was, she needed his assessment if she had any hope of negotiating a better price. The railroad's offer was generous, but it came with strings she didn't trust. "Fine," she said, "after 2. And stay out of my way." His mouth curved just slightly. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the drawl in it made her want to throw something. She drove the wagon back to Whisper Ranch, with her jaw set and her mind racing. The ranch sat 3 miles west of town, tucked into a wide valley where the creek ran year-round, and the grass grew thick enough to support 200 head of cattle. Her father had built it from nothing, and she'd been running it alone since his death 2 years ago. Alone, except for Miguel. the ranch hand who'd stayed loyal even when the creditors came circling. Alone except for the debt she'd hidden so carefully that even Miguel didn't know how deep it ran. The banker in Stone Valley had been patient for 18 months. But patience had limits. She owed $3,000, a sum that would have been manageable if the drought hadn't hit last summer and the beef prices hadn't dropped in the fall. The railroad's buyout offer would clear the debt and leave her with enough to start over somewhere else. Somewhere no one knew she'd failed. Somewhere she wouldn't have to see the pity in the eyes of the men who'd once respected her father. But leaving meant losing the only home she'd ever known. And worse, it meant proving that the man who'd broken their engagement 3 years ago had been right when he'd said she wasn't strong enough to hold a ranch alone. She pulled the wagon to a stop near the barn and climbed down, boots hitting packed earth with a solid thud. Miguel emerged from the stable, his weathered face creasing into a frown when he saw the dust on her skirt. "What happened?" he said. She told him about the gunshot, the stranger, the cattle buyer who'd be arriving in a few hours. Miguel's frown deepened. "You think the railroad sent someone to scare you?" he asked. She shook her head. "I don't know," she said. "But I'm not running. Not yet." The afternoon sun was slanting low when Gideon Sloan rode up the valley road on a roan gelding that looked like it had covered 1,000 miles without complaint. Elsie watched him from the porch, her arms crossed, her expression carefully neutral. He dismounted with the kind of easy grace that came from years in the saddle, and she hated that she noticed. Miguel stood beside her, silent and watchful, his hand resting on the rifle propped against the porch rail. Gideon walked toward them, his coat open now, his hat tipped back just enough to show his face. "Afternoon," he said, and nodded to Miguel before turning his full attention to Elsie. "I appreciate you letting me take a look." She didn't bother with pleasantries. "The herd's in the north pasture," she said. "Miguel will take you. I've got work." Gideon's gaze held hers for a beat too long, and she saw the flicker of something that might have been curiosity or might have been calculation. "Actually," he said, "I was hoping you'd show me yourself. I've got questions about your operation that your hand probably can't answer." It was reasonable. It was also inconvenient, because the last thing she wanted was to spend an hour alone with a man who made her feel off balance. But refusing would look weak, and she couldn't afford that. "Fine," she said. "Let's go." She fetched her horse, a sturdy bay mare named Cinder, and rode out with Gideon in silence. The north pasture spread wide and green under the late sun, dotted with cattle that lifted their heads to watch as the riders approached. Gideon pulled his horse to a stop at the pasture's edge and studied the herd with the kind of focus that told her he knew his business. 200 head, she said before he could ask. Mixed breed, mostly Hereford and Longhorn Cross. Healthy stock. He nodded slowly. "They look good," he said. "Better than I expected given the drought last year. How'd you manage that?" She kept her voice level. "Creek never runs dry," she said. "And I sold off the weak ones early before the prices dropped too far." He glanced at her, and for the first time she saw something like respect in his expression. "That takes guts," he said. "Most ranchers hold on too long, hoping the market'll turn." She shrugged. "Hope doesn't pay bills," she said, and regretted the words the moment they left her mouth. They revealed too much. Gideon's gaze sharpened, but he didn't push. Instead, he rode closer to the herd, watching the cattle move, checking their condition with a practiced eye. After a long silence, he turned back to her. "You're sitting on a valuable operation," he said. "Even with the market down, this herd's worth twice what the railroad's offering for the land." Her chest tightened. "Then you'll tell them that," she said. He hesitated, and the pause stretched too long. "That's the thing, Miss Hawthorne," he said. "I'm not working for the railroad. I'm working for a consortium of buyers in Denver. They sent me to assess whether it's worth making you a counteroffer." The world tilted. She'd assumed, everyone had assumed, that the cattle buyer was part of the railroad's pressure campaign. But if he was working for competitors, that changed everything. It also meant she couldn't trust a word he said. "Why should I believe you?" she said, and her voice came out colder than she'd intended. He met her eyes, steady and unflinching. "Because I just told you your cattle are worth more than the deal you're considering," he said. "If I wanted to cheat you, I'd have told you to take the railroad's offer and run." It was logical. It was also exactly what a clever liar would say. She turned Cinder back toward the ranch house without answering, and Gideon followed in silence. By the time they reached the barn, the sun was nearly down, painting the sky in shades of copper and ash. She dismounted and handed Cinder's reins to Miguel, who'd been waiting by the corral. Gideon swung down from his roan and stood there, hat in hand, looking like he had something else to say. "I'll need a few days to write up my assessment," he said, "and I'd like to go over your books, if you're willing. Make sure the numbers match what I'm seeing." Her pulse spiked. The books would show the debt. They'd show how close she was to losing everything. But refusing would make her look like she had something worse to hide. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. He nodded, settled his hat back on his head, and mounted up. Then he paused, looking down at her with that same unreadable expression. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you're doing something impressive here. Don't let them bully you into giving it up." He rode off before she could answer, and she stood there in the gathering dark, heart pounding, wondering if she'd just made a terrible mistake. That night, Elsie sat at her father's old desk in the ranch house parlor, the ledger open in front of her, the lamp casting shadows across columns of numbers that didn't add up the way she needed them to. The debt stared back at her from the page, $3,000 in red ink that might as well have been blood. She'd borrowed the money 2 years ago to buy seed stock after a hard winter killed half the herd. The banker had been sympathetic then, an old friend of her father's, willing to extend credit on the promise of future profits. But profits had been slow. The drought, the market drop, the constant pressure from the railroad investors who wanted her land for the new rail line. Every month, she made the minimum payment and watched the interest climb. Every month she told herself she'd find a way, and every month the weight of it pressed harder on her chest until she could barely breathe. The knock on the door startled her so badly she nearly knocked the lamp over. She closed the ledger, heart hammering, and crossed to the door. Miguel stood on the porch, his face grim in the lantern light. "We got trouble," he said. "Someone cut the north fence. Cattle are starting to drift." She didn't waste time on questions. She grabbed her coat and hat and followed him into the night. They rode hard through the darkness, the cold air biting at her face, and reached the north pasture to find exactly what Miguel had described. A 20-foot section of fence lay flat, the posts cut clean through, and a dozen head of cattle had already wandered through the gap into the open range beyond. It would take hours to round them up, and in the dark they'd lose more. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this deliberately, and the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. The railroad, Miguel said quietly. Or someone who wants you to think it's the railroad. She swung down from Cinder and crouched by the cut posts, running her gloved hand over the clean edges. This was done with a saw, she said. Took time. Whoever did it wanted us to know it was sabotage. They spent the next 3 hours rounding up strays, and by the time they drove the last steer back through the gap, the sky was starting to pale in the east. Elsie's hands were numb, her back ached, and her temper was running on fumes. Miguel helped her string temporary rope across the gap, enough to hold until they could replace the posts. You need to report this, he said. She shook her head. To who? She said. The sheriff's in the railroad's pocket. He'll write it down and do nothing. Miguel's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. She rode back to the ranch house as the sun broke over the hills, exhaustion dragging at her bones. The lamp was still burning in the parlor window where she'd left it, a small golden square against the gray dawn. She unsaddled Cinder, rubbed the mare down, and stumbled into the house. The ledger still sat on the desk, closed now, mocking her. She thought about Gideon Sloan and his offer to review the books. She thought about the cut fence and the gunshot on the platform, and the suffocating pressure of choices that all led to losing. Then she thought about her father, who'd told her on his deathbed that running was easy, and staying was the hard work that mattered. She hadn't understood then. She understood now. Gideon arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, riding up the valley road with the same easy confidence he'd shown the day before. Elsie met him on the porch, her hair hastily pinned, her dress dusty from the night's work. His gaze swept over her, taking in the exhaustion she couldn't hide, and his expression shifted. What happened? He said. She told him about the fence, the cattle, the long cold hours in the dark. His face hardened. You report it, he asked. She shook her head. Won't do any good, she said. He was quiet for a moment, then nodded. All right, he said. Show me the books. Let's see what we're really dealing with. She led him inside to the parlor, her stomach knotting. The ledger sat on the desk like an accusation. She opened it without preamble and stepped back, letting him see the numbers that would destroy any chance of a decent offer. Gideon pulled out the chair, sat down, and started reading. His face gave nothing away. She stood by the window, arms crossed, waiting for the judgment she knew was coming. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up. 3,000, he said. That's the debt. She nodded. The banker's been patient, she said, keeping her voice steady. But I'm running out of time. Gideon's gaze didn't waver. And the railroad offer would clear it, he said. Yes, she said, with enough left over to start somewhere else. He leaned back in the chair, his expression thoughtful. But you don't want to leave, he said. It wasn't a question. She met his eyes and saw something there she hadn't expected. Understanding, maybe. Or recognition. No, she said quietly. I don't want to leave. But wanting doesn't pay debts. He nodded slowly, then closed the ledger. Here's what I see, he said. You've got a solid operation, good land, healthy stock, and an owner who knows what she's doing. The debt's a problem, but it's not insurmountable. If you can hold out another 6 months, the beef prices will likely recover. You could clear the debt and keep the ranch. Her chest tightened. 6 months is a long time, she said. And the railroad's not going to wait that long. Gideon stood, and for a moment they were close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jaw, the lines at the corners of his eyes that came from years of squinting into the sun. Then give me a week, he said. Let me talk to my buyers in Denver. See if we can put together a bridge loan that'll buy you time. She stared at him. Why would you do that? She said. You don't even know me. His mouth curved slightly. Maybe I know enough, she said. The offer shook her more than the sabotage had. It was exactly what she needed, and that made it dangerous. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that someone was finally on her side. But trust was the currency that had bankrupted her before. Her fiancé, charming and ambitious, had promised to stand with her after her father died. Instead, he'd tried to pressure her into selling the ranch, pocket the money, and move to Denver, where he could build his law practice without the inconvenience of a working cattle operation. When she'd refused, he'd broken the engagement and told half of Stone Valley that she was too proud and too stubborn to accept help. The humiliation had been worse than the heartbreak. She'd spent 3 years rebuilding her reputation, proving she could run the ranch alone. And now this stranger with the careful eyes and the trail dust was offering help she desperately needed, but couldn't afford to accept if it came with strings. I'll think about it, she said, and Gideon nodded like he'd expected that answer. Fair enough, he said. In the meantime, I'm going to ask around town, see if anyone saw anything unusual last night. She frowned. I told you, the sheriff won't help. Gideon's smile was thin. I'm not planning to ask the sheriff, he said. He left shortly after, and Elsie spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on ranch work and failing. Miguel replaced the fence posts while she rode the south pasture, checking for more damage, finding none. By afternoon, her nerves were strung tight as wire, and when the sound of hoofbeats echoed up the valley road, she nearly jumped out of her skin. But it wasn't Gideon. It was the banker, Mr. Whitmore, his round face flushed, and his expression somewhere between apologetic and anxious. He dismounted heavily and approached the porch where Elsie stood waiting. Miss Hawthorne, he said, and the false cheer in his voice made her stomach drop. I'm afraid I have some unfortunate news. The bank's been sold, Whitmore said, and his voice had the quality of a man delivering bad news he didn't fully understand himself. New ownership out of Denver. They're calling in all outstanding loans over $2,000. I'm sorry, Miss Hawthorne, but they're giving you 30 days to pay in full, or they'll foreclose. The words hit like a fist to the chest. 30 days. She'd been counting on 6 months, maybe a year if she could negotiate. 30 days meant the ranch was gone, unless she took the railroad's offer immediately. You can't do this, she said, and hated the shake in her voice. We had an agreement. Whitmore spread his hands helplessly. It's out of my control, he said. The new owners have their own policies. I argued for an extension, but they wouldn't budge. Her mind raced. The new ownership out of Denver. Gideon had said he worked for a consortium of buyers in Denver. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. Her blood went cold. Did the new bank owners have any connection to cattle buyers? She asked, keeping her voice level. Whitmore blinked. I don't know. He stammered. I suppose it's possible. Why do you ask? She didn't answer. She was already moving, striding past him toward the barn. Miguel, she called. Saddle Cinder. I'm going to town. She rode hard, fury and betrayal burning through the exhaustion. She'd been played, Gideon Sloan had offered help with one hand while tightening the noose with the other. The bridge loan, the sympathetic words, the careful assessment of her operation. All of it designed to get her desperate enough to accept whatever deal he offered next. She found him at the hotel, sitting in the small dining room with a cup of coffee and a newspaper. He looked up when she stormed in, and the flicker of surprise on his face might have been genuine, or might have been performance. She didn't care. She crossed the room in 4 strides and slammed her palms on the table. "You lying son of a rattlesnake," she said, and every head in the room turned. Gideon set down his coffee with deliberate calm. "Miss Hawthorne," he said quietly, "maybe we should take this outside." She leaned in, keeping her voice low and venomous. "The bank just called in my loan," she said. 30 days. New ownership out of Denver. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" His face went hard. "No," he said flatly. "I wouldn't." She laughed, sharp and bitter. "You expect me to believe that," she said. "You show up offering help the same week the bank gets sold and my loan gets called. That's a hell of a coincidence." Gideon stood, and his height forced her to step back. "It is a coincidence," he said, and his voice carried an edge now. "But I can see you've already made up your mind." The anger in his eyes looked real, but she'd been fooled by sincerity before. "Prove it," she said. He stared at her for a long moment, then grabbed his hat and coat. "Come with me," he said. She followed him out onto the street, her heart pounding, half expecting him to disappear or turn the tables. Instead, he led her 3 blocks to the telegraph office. Inside, he pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and handed it to her. "Read it," he said. It was a telegram, dated 2 days before he'd arrived in Stone Valley. It was addressed to Gideon Sloan from a firm called Western Livestock Assessors in Denver, and it confirmed his assignment to evaluate the Hawthorne Ranch and report back within 2 weeks. There was no mention of banks, no mention of loans, nothing that suggested he was part of a larger scheme. Elsie read it twice, then looked up at him. "This doesn't prove you're not involved," she said, but her voice had lost some of its heat. "It proves I'm doing the job I was hired to do," Gideon said. Nothing more. She wanted to believe him. That was the worst part. She wanted to believe that someone had finally shown up who wasn't trying to manipulate her. But belief was dangerous, and she learned that lesson the hard way. "I need to go," she said, and handed the telegram back. Gideon caught her wrist gently as she turned. "Wait," he said. "If you didn't do this," she said, "then who did? And why now?" He released her wrist but didn't step back. "I don't know," he said. "But I'm going to find out." She left him standing in the telegraph office and rode back to the ranch as the sun slanted low. Her mind wouldn't settle. The coincidence was too perfect, but the telegram seemed legitimate. Unless it was a forgery. Unless the whole thing was a deeper game than she'd imagined. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the rider waiting near the ranch house. It was a young man she didn't recognize, holding an envelope. He tipped his hat nervously. "Miss Hawthorne," he said. "I was told to deliver this to you personal." She took the envelope, and the boy rode off before she could ask who'd sent him. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with a message written in careful block letters. "If you want to know who's really behind the bank sale and the loan call, meet me at the old mill tonight at 9. Come alone." She read it 3 times, her pulse climbing. It was obviously a trap. It was also the only lead she had. Miguel found her standing on the porch at sunset, the letter still in her hand. "You're not seriously thinking about going," he said when she told him. She folded the paper and met his eyes. "I have to know," she said. "Then I'm coming with you," Miguel said. She shook her head. The note said, "Come alone. If someone's watching, they'll spook." Miguel's face set in stubborn lines. "Then I'll follow at a distance," he said. "You're not riding into an ambush without backup." She left the ranch at 8:30, riding Cinder at a steady pace toward the old mill on the south edge of Stone Valley. The mill had been abandoned for 5 years, its wheel broken, and its roof half collapsed. It sat beside a narrow tributary creek, surrounded by cottonwoods that made the shadows thick, even in daylight. At night, it was a pocket of darkness that swallowed sound. She dismounted 50 yards out and approached on foot, her hand resting on the small revolver she carried in her coat pocket. The mill loomed ahead, a black silhouette against the star-filled sky. She heard nothing but the creak and the wind. Then, a voice spoke from the shadows near the mill door. "Miss Hawthorne," the voice said, low and male and unfamiliar. "Glad you came." She stopped, her hand tightening on the revolver. "Who are you?" she called. "What do you know about the bank?" The figure stepped into the faint moonlight, and she saw a man of medium height, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. "I know the new owners are a shell company," he said, "fronting for someone local who wants your land bad enough to force you out." Her pulse hammered. "Who?" she demanded. He took another step closer, and she drew the revolver, leveling it at his chest. "That's close enough," she said. He stopped, raising his hand slowly. "Easy," he said. "I'm trying to help." "Then tell me who's behind it," she said. The man hesitated, and in that pause she heard the creak of a board behind her. She spun, but too late. A second figure lunged from the mill's side door, and something hard cracked across the back of her head. The world tilted, her vision sparking, and she went down hard on the cold ground. She woke to the sound of voices and the smell of damp wood. Her head throbbed, her wrists were tied, and she was sitting on the dirt floor of the mill's interior. A lantern hung from a beam, casting flickering light over 2 men. One was the man who'd called her here. The other was Sheriff Dorsey, his badge glinting in the lantern light, his expression cold. Her stomach dropped. "The sheriff," she said, her voice rough. "You're behind this." Dorsey smiled without warmth. "Not behind it," he said. "Just making sure it goes smooth. The railroad's paying good money to clear this valley, and your stubbornness has been a problem." The other man shifted uncomfortably. "We weren't supposed to hurt her," he muttered. Dorsey shot him a look. "She'll be fine," he said. "Soon as she signs the transfer papers." Elsie's mind raced through her options. Miguel was out there somewhere, but he didn't know where the mill was. Gideon didn't know she was here. No one was coming. "You can't force me to sign," she said. Dorsey crouched in front of her, his face close. "I think I can," he said. "See, we're going to tell folks you sold the ranch tonight and left town. And if anyone asks questions later, well, accidents happen on the frontier." Her blood ran cold. This wasn't a scare tactic. They were planning to kill her. She forced herself to breathe, to think. "Stall," she told herself. Buy time. The papers, she said. Where are they? Let me see what I'm signing. Dorsey nodded to the other man, who pulled a folded document from his coat. Elsie scanned it quickly. It was a transfer deed, selling Whisper Ranch to a company she'd never heard of for 1/10 of its value. Her signature line waited at the bottom, and beside it, a witness line already signed by Sheriff Dorsey. This won't hold up, she said. Any judge will see it's coerced. Dorsey shrugged. By the time it gets to a judge, you'll be long gone, he said, and the railroad will have what it needs. He pulled a pen and ink bottle from his coat pocket. Sign it, he said. Now. She met his eyes and saw nothing but cold calculation. She thought about her father, about the years of work he'd poured into the ranch. She thought about running, about starting over somewhere else, about living with the knowledge that she'd been driven out by men like Dorsey. Then she heard it, the faint sound of a horse outside, moving fast. Dorsey heard it too. His head snapped toward the door, and he motioned sharply to the other man. Check it, he said. The man drew his revolver and moved toward the door. It burst open before he reached it, and Gideon Sloan stepped through with his own gun drawn. The other man froze. Dorsey swore and lunged for Elsie, dragging her to her feet and pressing a knife to her throat. Don't move, he shouted at Gideon. Gideon stopped, his gun still trained on Dorsey. Let her go, he said, his voice deadly calm. The sheriff's not worth dying for. Dorsey's laugh was sharp and bitter. You got no idea what you just walked into, he said. This is railroad business. You're just a drifter. Walk away and you live. Gideon's gaze flicked to Elsie, and she saw something fierce and uncompromising in his eyes. Not happening, he said. The standoff stretched, seconds ticking past like hours. Elsie felt the cold edge of the blade against her skin, felt Dorsey's tension vibrating through his grip. Then Miguel's voice called from outside. Sheriff? You got 4 rifles aimed at that door. Let her go and we'll talk. Dorsey's breath hitched. He glanced toward the door, calculating odds. Gideon took 1 step closer. It's over, he said quietly. You can't win this. Make the smart choice. For a moment, Elsie thought Dorsey would do it, would cut her throat and try to shoot his way out. Then, he shoved her hard toward Gideon and bolted for the back wall. There was a second door there, half hidden behind a fallen beam. He crashed through it and vanished into the night. Gideon caught Elsie before she hit the ground, steadying her with one hand while keeping his gun trained on the other man. Miguel and 2 ranch hands from a neighboring spread came through the front door, rifles ready. The other man dropped his gun and raised his hands. I didn't sign up for murder, he said quickly. I'll testify. Dorsey planned the whole thing. Gideon holstered his gun and pulled a knife from his belt, cutting the ropes on Elsie's wrists. You all right? He asked, and his voice was rough with something that might have been fear. She nodded, rubbing feeling back into her hands. How did you know? She asked. He gave her a crooked smile. Miguel came to the hotel looking for you, he said. When we figured out where you'd gone, I rode hard. Wasn't about to let you face this alone. The warmth in his eyes made her chest ache. She wanted to lean into him, to let someone else carry the weight for just a moment. But the danger wasn't over. Dorsey's still out there, she said. And the railroad's not going to stop just because one plan failed. Gideon's expression hardened. Then we take it to court, he said. We've got a witness. We've got the forged deed, and we've got enough to prove conspiracy. The railroad can't touch you if this goes public. Miguel stepped forward. The town council meets tomorrow, he said. If we bring this to them, they'll have to act. Dorsey's been dirty for years, but this is proof. Elsie looked around at the faces watching her. Men who'd ridden out in the dark to help. Men who believed she was worth fighting for. The shame that had been choking her for 3 years loosened, just slightly. All right, she said. We go to the council. We make this public. And we fight. The town council meeting the next day was packed. Every bench in the Stone Valley Municipal Hall was filled, and people stood along the walls 3 deep. Elsie sat in the front row, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap. Gideon sat beside her, a solid presence that made it easier to breathe. Miguel and the witness from the mill sat on her other side. Across the aisle, the railroad's lawyers sat with 2 men in expensive suits, their faces carefully neutral. The council chairman, an older man named Hargrove, called the meeting to order and asked Elsie to present her case. She stood, her heart pounding, and told the story. The cut fence, the called loan, the ambush at the mill, the sheriff's confession. She kept her voice steady, her gaze moving across the faces in the crowd. When she finished, the room was silent. Then, Gideon stood and placed the forged deed on the chairman's desk. This is what they tried to force her to sign, he said. It's fraud, coercion, and attempted murder, and it's all tied to the railroad's buyout plan. The railroad's lawyer rose smoothly. These are serious allegations, he said. With no proof beyond the word of a desperate woman and a hired cattle buyer with his own agenda. He looked directly at Elsie. Miss Hawthorne, isn't it true that you're deeply in debt and facing foreclosure? Isn't it possible that you fabricated this story to gain sympathy and avoid losing your ranch? The words hit like a slap. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Elsie felt the old shame rise, hot and choking. Then Gideon's hand closed over hers, warm and steady. She stood again, and this time she met the lawyer's eyes without flinching. Yes, she said clearly. I'm in debt. I've been struggling to keep my ranch afloat for 2 years. But that doesn't make me a liar. And it doesn't change the fact that your clients tried to force me off my land through intimidation and violence. She turned to face the crowd. I'm not the only one they've pressured, she said. How many of you have been offered buyouts you didn't want? How many of you have had accidents or setbacks that felt too convenient? A rancher in the back stood. My barn burned last month, he called. Fire marshal said it was lightning, but there hadn't been a storm in weeks. A woman near the front raised her hand. My husband was beaten on the road from his claim, she said. They told him to sell, or next time it'd be worse. One by one, voices rose. Stories of pressure, threats, mysterious accidents. The railroad's lawyer tried to speak over them, but the chairman banged his gavel. Order, he said. Then he turned to the lawyer. It seems Miss Hawthorne is not alone in her concerns, he said. I'm calling for a full investigation into the railroad's land acquisition practices. Until that investigation is complete, all pending buyouts are suspended. The room erupted. The railroad's lawyer protested loudly, but Hargrove banged the gavel again. This meeting is adjourned, he said. The crowd surged forward. and Elsie found herself surrounded by people shaking her hand, thanking her, promising support. It was overwhelming and affirming and terrifying all at once. Then, Gideon's hand found her elbow, guiding her toward the door. "Let's get you some air," he said quietly. They stepped outside into the bright afternoon, and Elsie sucked in a breath of clean wind. Her hands were shaking. Gideon led her around the side of the building, away from the crowd, and leaned against the wall beside her. "You did good in there," he said. She laughed, shaky and breathless. "I thought I was going to throw up," she said. He smiled. "Couldn't tell," he said. "You looked fearless." She turned to face him, and the space between them felt charged. "I wasn't," she said quietly. "I was terrified. But you were there. That helped." His expression shifted, something unguarded flickering across his face. "Elsie," he said, and then stopped. She waited, her heart pounding. He took a breath. "I need to tell you something," he said. "The bank that bought your loan, the one calling it in. I did some digging. It's owned by a shell company, but I traced it back. It's connected to your ex-fiancé." Her world tilted. "Daniel," she said, and the name tasted like ash. Gideon nodded. "He's been working with the railroad's legal team for 6 months," he said. "I think he's the one who engineered the loan call. Revenge for you refusing to sell when you were together." The betrayal was so deep, it took her breath. She'd known Daniel was ambitious, but this was calculated cruelty. He'd waited 3 years, then struck exactly when she was most vulnerable. Gideon's hand touched her shoulder. Gentle. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know this is hard. But now we know who we're really fighting. And we can expose him." She met his eyes, and something inside her steadied. "Thank you," she said, "for finding out. For being here. For not walking away when I accused you." He smiled slightly. "I don't walk away easy," he said. She realized how close they were standing. Close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. The attraction that had been simmering since the moment he'd pulled her out of the line of fire flared hot and undeniable. She should step back. She should keep the distance that had protected her for 3 years. Instead, she leaned in, and Gideon's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. "You sure?" he asked quietly, and the question held more than the kiss. It held everything. Trust, risk, the possibility of another betrayal, or the chance at something real. She answered by closing the distance, her mouth finding his. The kiss was slow and searching, and it tasted like hope. When they finally pulled apart, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. "I'm not him," he said, and she knew he meant Daniel. "I know," she whispered. "I'm starting to believe that." The investigation moved quickly, once the council committed resources. Within a week, Daniel's involvement was confirmed. He'd used his legal connections to set up the shell company, orchestrated the loan call, and coordinated with Sheriff Dorsey to pressure Elsie into selling. When the evidence went public, his law practice collapsed, and the railroad quietly severed ties. Dorsey was arrested trying to flee to California. The witness from the mill testified in exchange for leniency, and the case against the railroad's coercion tactics grew ironclad. The bank, under scrutiny and facing legal action, extended Elsie's loan for 2 years at a reduced rate. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was breathing room. Gideon's buyers in Denver offered a fair price for a third of her herd, enough to make a significant dent in the debt. And the railroad, facing a public relations disaster and potential criminal charges, withdrew their buyout offer and rerouted the rail line 10 miles south. Elsie stood on the porch of the ranch house one evening in early spring, watching the sun set over the valley that was still hers. The grass was turning green, the cattle were sleek and healthy, and the weight that had been crushing her chest for 3 years had finally lifted. She heard the sound of hoofbeats and turned to see Gideon riding up the valley road. He'd been staying in Stone Valley for the past 2 months, ostensibly to finish his assessment and help coordinate the herd sale. But they both knew the real reason. He dismounted and climbed the porch steps, his expression warm. "Got a telegram today," he said. "The buyers want me back in Denver. New assignment." Her heart sank even as she kept her face neutral. "When do you leave?" she asked. He stepped closer, his gaze steady on hers. "That depends," he said. "On what?" she asked. "On whether you want me to stay," he said. She stared at him. "Gideon," she said slowly, "you have a job, a life. You can't just give that up." He shrugged. "I can do assessments anywhere," he said. "And I've been thinking it's time I settled down, found a place worth staying for." Hope flared so bright it hurt. "You mean that?" she said. He reached for her hand. "I mean it," he said. "I know you've been burned. I know trust doesn't come easy for you. But I'm not asking you to decide today. I'm just asking you to let me prove I'm here for the long run." She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. The face that had become familiar, beloved, necessary. "I don't need time," she said quietly. "I've been sure for weeks. I just didn't think you'd want to stay." His smile was slow and devastating. "Then I guess we're both learning to believe in something better," he said. He pulled her close, and she went into his arms without hesitation. The kiss was deep and sure, full of promise and plans, and the kind of trust that came from standing together through fire. When they finally broke apart, she rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. "Marry me," he said into her hair. She pulled back just enough to see his face. "That's not a question," she said, but she was smiling. He grinned. "Marry me," he said again, and this time it was. She thought about the years ahead, the work and the risk, and the beautiful ordinary days of building a life together. She thought about the ranch that would stay in her family, the valley that would remain free, the future that was finally hers to shape. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Stone Valley, with Miguel standing as witness and half the town crowding into the pews. Elsie wore a dress of deep blue, the color of the sky before a storm, and carried wildflowers picked that morning from the valley. Gideon wore a new black coat and a string tie, and when he took her hand at the altar, his grip was steady and sure. The preacher spoke about commitment and partnership, and weathering the hard times together, and every word felt like it had been written for them. When the ceremony ended, and they walked down the aisle as husband and wife, the townspeople cheered. Outside, the spring sunlight was warm and bright, and the valley spread before them in shades of green and gold. They rode back to Whisper Ranch side by side, Gideon on his roan and Elsie on Cinder. And when they reached the crest of the hill overlooking the property, they stopped. "This is ours now," Elsie said quietly. Gideon reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. Ours, he agreed, and we're going to make it something worth holding on to. They built a life measured in seasons and shared work. Gideon took over managing the cattle sales and opened a small assessment business that brought steady income. Elsie expanded the ranch, buying back acreage that had been sold during the hard years. They hired 2 more ranch hands, and Miguel became the foreman, his loyalty rewarded with a share of the profits. The debt shrank steadily, paid down month by month until the day Elsie walked into the bank and handed over the final payment. The ranch prospered. The railroad brought commerce without stealing land, and Stone Valley grew into a town where people could build futures without fear. Elsie's name became synonymous with stubborn integrity, and when ranchers faced trouble, they came to her for advice. Gideon earned a reputation as a fair dealer, the kind of man who valued honesty over profit. Together, they became a fixture in the valley, the couple who'd fought for their home and won. On a warm evening, 2 years after the wedding, Elsie stood in the doorway of the ranch house, watching Gideon work with a young gelding in the corral. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who'd found his place, and the sight made her heart swell. She rested a hand on her belly, feeling the flutter of new life there, and smiled. She hadn't told him yet. Tonight, she decided. Tonight she'd tell him that the family they'd started was growing, that the future they'd fought for was taking shape in ways neither of them had imagined. Gideon looked up and saw her watching. He grinned and vaulted the corral fence, crossing the yard in long strides. "What's that smile for?" he asked, pulling her into his arms. She looked up at him. This man who'd ridden into her life at the worst possible moment and stayed through everything that followed. "I was just thinking," she said. "About what?" he asked. "About how sometimes the best things come from the hardest fights," she said, "and how lucky I am that you're stubborn enough to stay." He kissed her forehead. "We're both stubborn," he said. "That's why it works." She laughed and took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Come inside," she said. "There's something I need to tell you." The curiosity in his eyes made her smile widen. He followed her into the house, and she closed the door behind them, shutting out the world and holding close the life they'd built. The valley stretched quiet and green under the stars, and Whisper Ranch stood solid and enduring, a testament to the kind of love that was worth fighting for, the kind that didn't come easy, but once earned, lasted a lifetime. The years that followed were marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the quiet joys of partnership. Their daughter was born in the spring, a fierce little thing with her mother's chestnut hair and her father's steady gaze. They named her Clara, after Elsie's mother, and she grew up riding the valley trails and learning the business of cattle and land. 2 years later, a son arrived, dark-haired and adventurous, and the ranch house filled with the sounds of children laughing and arguing and learning what it meant to build something worth keeping. Elsie and Gideon taught their children the lessons they'd learned the hard way, that trust had to be earned through action, not promises, that standing your ground mattered, even when the odds looked impossible. That home wasn't just a place, it was the people you fought beside, and the life you chose to build together. The children grew strong and capable, shaped by the valley and the values their parents lived every day. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Gideon surprised Elsie with a new sign for the ranch gate. It was carved from oak and painted in careful letters that read Whisper Ranch, Est. 1868. Hawthorne and Sloan. she stood looking at it in the morning light, her hand in his, and felt the years stretch behind and ahead like the valley itself. Endless and beautiful, and worth every moment of the fight. "This is perfect," she said quietly. He squeezed her hand. "We're perfect," he said. "Imperfect and stubborn, and exactly right." She leaned into him, and they stood together in the shadow of the sign that bore both their names, a symbol of the life they'd claimed and the love that had made it possible. The story of Elsie Hawthorne and Gideon Sloan became the kind of tale people told around fires and passed down through generations. The rancher who refused to run, and the cattle buyer who chose to stay. The couple who faced down corruption and came out stronger. The love that was forged in conflict and tempered by trust. In Stone Valley, their names became legend, a reminder that sometimes the hardest battles led to the sweetest victories, and that the best kind of home was the one you built with someone brave enough to stand beside you through everything. Whisper Ranch endured long after they were gone, passed down to Clara and then to her children, a living monument to the stubborn courage of two people who refused to let fear or betrayal or debt steal what mattered most. The valley changed over the decades, but the ranch remained, solid and enduring, a piece of the frontier preserved in the hands of those who understood its value. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew down from the hills and the cattle grazed peaceful under the stars, you could almost hear the echo of two voices, laughing and planning and promising to hold on, no matter what storms came. Because that was the legacy they left. Not just land or cattle or buildings, but the unshakable truth that love, when it was real and earned and fought for, could outlast anything.